Okay, thank you very much, Amira, for that warm welcome. And I'd also like to thank Jakub, Nick, and Lou for inviting me. It's really lovely to be here. And thank you all for coming on this very warm and sunny afternoon. Hopefully you'll feel that it was worth that sacrifice if Berlin weather's anything like the weather in London. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to speak to one of the chapters in this book that has just come out. I'm still just getting used to the fact that it's out because it's just come out a few weeks ago. But this book, Colonial Lives of Property, Law, Land, and Racial Regimes of Ownership, is one in which I essentially make the argument by looking at a range of different settler colonial sites that laws of modern property emerge in conjunction with racial subjects or with racial formations. And I capture this co-emergence through the term racial regimes of ownership. Racial regimes, some of you may be familiar with the term as developed by the late Cedric Robinson, and I take some of that, I derive a lot of inspiration from Black radical scholarship, drawing on the work of Cedric Robinson, Stuart Hall, Cheryl Harris, and others, to develop the argument that we can't really think about modern laws of property without thinking about race, nor can we think about race without really thinking about property. Now, that idea of race that I work with throughout the book is one in which, and I chose the work of Avtar Bra to discuss in the seminar tomorrow, because I think Avtar's work, when it comes to having a very complex notion of what intersectionality means, she really is, I think, one of our most important thinkers on this concept. And she explores in her work how race is expressed through gender. And along with that, of course, comes sexuality and sexual norms. And so in the book, I try to keep this gendered notion of race with me throughout all of the chapters, but I get to it very specifically in the 4th chapter on status, and that's what I'm going to speak about now. So the basic argument in this chapter of the book is about how the creation of Indian status in the Canadian context in the initial phases of formal colonization, so in the mid-19th century, created what I call an identity property nexus, whereby racialized and gendered concept of identity was fused together with access to land. This will become more clear as I go through the lecture, but that's the basic idea. And so what I'm going to do now is give you a little bit of introduction to this idea of Indian status. Then I will proceed to think about what is the nature of modern juridical status. So what is status? And how does the modern instantiation of this very old juridical idea, how does it differ from its precedents? Then I will talk about the Indian Act, which is the piece of legislation that brought into being this idea of the Indian or Indian status. And in the last part of the paper, I will turn to some of the philosophical thinking I've done on trying to look at the philosophical underpinnings of this identity property nexus, really through a kind of critical engagement with the work of Locke, which probably isn't that surprising given the topic. Okay, so if you'll forgive me, I'm going to start reading from this text now. Indian status is a colonial invention of the mid-19th century, as English and French settlers were in the process of consolidating their colonial dominion over vast First Nations territories in the form of a federal state. The government enacted legislation that created the juridical category of the Indian. Binding together identity with access to land, Indian status became a core aspect of the colonial regulation of the lives of First Nations people from the mid-19th century until the present. So what's really important to bear in mind, and what I do in each chapter of the book, is I start with a very contemporary example, a very contemporary case study, and then trace its history. And so the problem that I'm talking about, although right now today in this lecture I'm really speaking about it a bit more historically, is one that remains a real a vexed problem and difficulty for many First Nations women and their children, and of course First Nations communities more generally. The creation of both the Indian as a juridical category and the Indian reserve marks a specific historical conjuncture, one in which identity and property relations were explicitly bound to each other, constituting a core dimension of an apparatus of colonial knowledge and governance. So I look to explore this conjuncture and what I refer to as the identity-property nexus, which continues as a very particular form of dispossession for many First Nations women and their children and their grandchildren. The relationship between status, broadly conceived, and property relations take on a specific double valence with the evolution of the modern common law of property. Status signifies a position that one occupies, determined by the law, often a result of a legislative mechanism. It affords the bearer of that status privileges, property, and properties that are both tangible and intangible. Status can be conceived of as an apparatus itself in that it signifies a conjuncture between juridical, economic, and social forces that work to regulate and produce subjects, and crucially, relations between subjects. So status is not immutable, but is transmissible in the sense that it can be inherited by one's descendants. Status as a concept does not reflect an essential quality about the bearer herself. It is more akin to a legal persona. However, this double valence emerges when legal status and the privileges and the value afforded the bearer of such status become affixed to the bodies of those occupying a specific juridical category, whether that be the immigrant, the refugee, or in this case, the Indian. In the settler colony, status expresses the co-articulation of racial and gendered properties of the subject and access to land. Identity becomes affixed to specific property relations. With respect to the status created by the colonial government for First Nations people in Canada, the legal designation shows no sign of diminishing, as economies of reserve land, which scaffold and justify the continued existence of Indian status, remain under federal jurisdiction. Status, historically, a legal fiction that designated a position that a person occupied rather than the person herself, has come in the modern era to reflect the articulation of abstract racial and gender characteristics with specific property relations, entitlement, and access to land. Status has become a racialized designation that is determined by an individual's gender and marital status, as you will see, and upon which access to one's land depends. It expresses the identity-property nexus that was forged by a juridical apparatus that structured and justified the appropriation of Indigenous land and the creation of reserves. And Indian status, as I will discuss in the third part of this paper, is constituted in relation to the ideal proper citizen subject, that is, the self-possessive individual. Now, the work in this chapter, and I'm just going to summarize the next bit, really draws upon the work of several Indigenous feminist Scholars, including Joanne Barker, for instance, who, writing about tribal membership and status in the American context, has really critiqued that regime of recognition. I draw on the work of Eileen Morton Robinson, who in the Australian context has identified the figure of the white possessive individual as central to the colonization of Australia. I just want to be clear that I have a quotation from Benita Lawrence, another First Nations scholar further on in the presentation, that this work really is indebted to the scholarship of those thinkers. Okay, now, status, just to go into a bit of discussion about what status is. Status as a legal concept has been a mechanism used to determine the political, economic, and legal conditions that an individual is subject to within both the public and private spheres. As Brenna Bhandar has observed, quote, official legal status has been used to define and legislate the very nature of personhood in society. Status determines membership, belonging, and may also define the rights and entitlements a political subject or actor demands of the state. And that's the end of the quote. Status derives from the Latin term stare, or legal standing, and in Roman law was used to define the rights of individuals vis-a-vis others and to govern both populations and territory. For the Romans, at least according to one 19th century English interpreter of Roman law, the status of the parties involved in a dispute was essential in determining the contours of the legal action. Status was of central significance for two reasons. One being that status could shift, thereby changing completely the rules applicable to the disputants. Another reason that status was of prime import to Roman law concerned the exigencies of empire. With territorial acquisition and the assertion of sovereignty came the need to determine the substance and meaning of jurisdiction. The conceptualization of jurisdiction that took hold during a long period of territorial acquisition, as Stuart Eldon has argued, was influenced by previous distinctions between the spiritual and temporal jurisdiction of canon law and civil law. But as territory became the object of rule, the status of individuals within a given territory determined their legal rights, determined their obligations and their incapacities. So status became a means of governing populations, interesting for my purposes, who were incorporated into the jurisdiction of Roman rule through conquest. Now, one's legal status was not immutable, as is generally the case with the notion of legal capacity that we've inherited from the early modern common law. So in the Roman world, the legal status of women, for instance, could change with marriage. If a freed woman married with the consent of her patron, she would be released from the obligation of work. A manumitted slave could gain full citizenship, including the right to vote and to occupy government offices. As Orlando Patterson notes, in Rome, and I quote, a group of slaves and freedmen exercised extraordinary power in both the executive and administrative branches of the imperial government. Now, of course, Patterson also argues that Roman lawyers invented the legal fiction of dominium or absolute ownership in order to more categorically distinguish between categories of owner and thing. He asserts that the three constituent elements set out in the new legal paradigm that emerged in the 1st century BC, persona, res, and dominium, corresponded to master, slave, and enslavement. So that is, Patterson's arguing that even with the mutability of legal persona or status, the treatment of slaves as objects of property was extremely violent and brutal, as it was in other systems of slavery. Now, while the manumitted classes would long be distinguished from those who were free-born, the latter could also be subjected to extreme forms of disenfranchisement. the punitive nature of the exile or banishment of inhabitants of the Roman territories was marked by the loss of status. And this is interesting to think about now, when a variety of nation states are trying to strip citizenship from people who are not born of the soil in those countries. So it reminds us that in the pre-modern era, actually banishing and exiling citizens was a normal practice. Now, there's, I'm going to summarize here for the sake of time, but in the modern era, status comes to function as a form of property in itself. So if we jump now several centuries to William Blackstone, we can think about status as something that he describes as a form of property. So you have the category of status property that refers to intangible or incorporeal forms of economic and social interest. You have a form of status property developing throughout the feudal era that is much more totalizing and kind of encapsulates the whole person. The lineages of social relations established through feudal hierarchies also point to a form of status property that encompasses individual subjects in a totalizing way, by which promises and entitlements are affixed not to an abstract legal persona, but also to the individual. Right? Hereditary titles of nobility, for instance, based on the grounds of biological kinship and the doctrine of primogeniture that assured firstborn males of the powers associated with ownership, were forms of status that ensured the reproduction of sociocultural norms and economic structures that prevailed in the UK throughout the colonial era. Now, in considering how status has functioned to determine the rights and entitlements of both individuals and entire groups of people in colonial contexts, an even more complex set of relations emerges. The transmissibility of status through biological inheritance was articulated through the racial and gendered schemas germane to the colonial appropriation of indigenous land and, of course, the institution of slavery in the United States. With regard to the latter case, the transmissibility of slave status was deemed to be matrilineal, ensuring the reproduction of a slave labor force and, to some extent, indemnifying white slave owners against the crimes of rape and sexual violence, or, in other circumstances, even evidence of relationships with black slave women, given that the children born of these situations remained the property of the white owner. Now, in considering how status as a juridical concept comes to signify differential value along the axes of race and gender, I argue that Indian status was defined in relation to the legal subjectivity of the possessive individual, who bears the status of the ideal citizen subject. And as I explore in this chapter, the creation of Indian status was concomitant with legislation that established federal jurisdiction over reserve lands and stipulated in great detail the rules governing life on the reserve. The ideal legal and political subject of the burgeoning settler state was the possessive individual, and the Indian of the Indian Act was defined in contradistinction to this figure. Now, before I go on to talk about the Indian Act in more detail now, I just want to make it very clear that I am speaking about the legislation that was passed by, and the system of governance that was imposed by the colonial state on First Nations in Canada. Now, the way that actually operated on the ground is a very different story, right? Because of the resistance and refusal of many First Nations to accept this system that was being imposed on them. So I just want to make that distinction clear, because I don't want you to gain the impression from this talk that what I am describing reflected some kind of total reality on the ground. That's a very important distinction to make. You know, as Audra Simpson has written, you know, we can diagnose, I'm paraphrasing, we can examine and excavate and diagnose the genocidal ambitions of settler states, but let's not forget that they have not been successful in those genocidal ambitions, right? Okay, now the identity property nexus in the settler colony of Canada was forged in relation to two distinct economies of land. One was the Indian Reserve, and the other a market for individual private property ownership that rested upon the fiction of underlying Crown sovereignty. Fictive because the Crown has never provided a plausible legal justification for asserting sovereignty over native land. The laws relating to land ownership were evidently informed by Lockean justifications for ownership. In British Columbia, for instance, land that was not visibly populated by agricultural settlements in the English model was often deemed to be wasteland open for appropriation by settlers. Concerns for creating and expanding commercial markets reflected the influence of Smithian political economy on the mentality of Canada's first legislators. So the self-possessive and appropriative subject was the ideal archetype of the settler. The legal designation of Indian was in many ways its inverse, defined in order to establish who had the right to reside on reserves, which were spaces intended to be kept outside and insulated from the market economy of mainstream society. Reserves were intended to be anachronistic spaces bounded by time and place, with the paternalistic aims of protecting First Nations from white settlers making incursions onto their lands and encouraging First Nations to assimilate by placing them in the extreme margins of the young settler nation state. Now, the first piece of federal legislation pertaining to Indian status and Indian lands was an act providing for the organization of the Department of the Secretary of State of Canada for the management of Indian and ordinance lands in 1868. This act was passed shortly after the British North America Act, so Canada's first constitution, which is the imperial legislation that united the Canadian provinces into a unified dominion. So you can see that the legislative apparatus that creates the juridical category of the Indian and federal control over Indian reserves happens, you know, right at the moment of the birth of Canada as a nation state. This act provided the constitutional architecture for the division of powers between federal and provincial governments, and Indian lands were to fall under federal jurisdiction. As John Malloy has written, the early legislation regulating the lands and lives of Indians reflected the colonial policy objectives of assimilation. So the earlier imperial policy of civilizing the natives was displaced by the objective of assimilating First Nations into the larger white settler population. The 1868 Act defined who an Indian was for the purposes of determining what persons are entitled to hold, use, or enjoy the lands and other immovable property provided for by the Act. And I have the definition from the 86 Indian Act there up on the screen. And we can see how First Nations women as independent subjects are essentially erased from the juridical category of Indian. They are categorized either as the child or the wife of a man. And what we see in these Indian Acts in this attempt to assimilate and civilize the native, a bourgeois Victorian sensibility that required Indian women to be treated as the property of their husbands. Thus, in an earlier piece of legislation in 1857, the Dominion Government of Canada passed a piece of legislation entitled An Act to Encourage the Gradual Civilization of the Indian Tribes in the Province. And this is recounted in a judgment from 2007, so thinking about its contemporary relevance, as the first act to inflict upon First Nations women and children the involuntary loss of status. So if a First Nations woman married a person who was not registered as an Indian, she and her children lost her status. So that's what I am trying to talk about this evening. That's the primary injustice that, and the very particularly gendered nature of the injustice of this creation of this juridical category of Indian. If she married a man who belonged to another band, then her name was automatically transferred to his band. And it's difficult to underestimate the radical effect of the imposition of this patriarchal system governing identity and access to land on First Nations women and communities. Scores of Indigenous feminists have written about the violence of this system and its continuing legacies. European explorers and settlers who described Aboriginal women as of the plains, so of the prairie provinces, as slaves and drudges, bequeathed their racist, sexist imagery to colonial administrators and modern-day anthropologists, who in their turn saw reserve life as a way of providing First Nations women with the potential for respectable domesticity. The racial and gendered configuration of Indian status led to the dispossession and disenfranchisement of generations of First Nations women. Indian status was the necessary precondition to access one's reserve land, which also means one's kinship and social networks, and the benefits and entitlements that attach to both the place of the reserve and the ascription of Indian status. Indian status, however, for First Nations women is not simply the means through which one accesses reserve land. Status has over time come to signify and encapsulate identity itself for many women. So the forms of psychic, existential, and material exile suffered by First Nations women who were stripped of their status by marrying non-Aboriginal men remain an ongoing legacy for women and their children who still have not obtained a just remedy for the dispossession of their rights to reside on their land. Now, it's important to note that under the definition, which is essentially in place in this form until 1985, that First Nations men who had status, who were status Indians, who married non-Indigenous women, those non-Indigenous women would gain Indian status. So we can see how, in this case, that the racial categorization that subtended the transmissibility of status was patrilineal and patriarchal, and the prevailing gender ideology was also thoroughly racialized, with First Nations women falling outside the bounds of propriety in relation to the gendered criteria of citizenship. Okay, now, in thinking about why, well, in addition to imposing Victorian bourgeois morality and norms through this colonial legislation, Benita Lawrence, as well as others, have argued that actually removing women from their positions in their communities and disenfranchising them was key to privatizing the land base. The imposition of patriarchal governance structures on reserves, combined with other means of weakening First Nations self-governance, severely impeded the ability of First Nations women, particularly in female-led communities, to protect the land base and provide for future generations. Okay, if you want to know more, you can read the chapter in the book. I'm going to skip ahead now to think about the philosophical structure underlying this particular form of dispossession. So the concept of Indian status is in some ways, as I mentioned before, a byproduct of Locke's understanding of the proprietorial subject. As I will explore now, drawing on the work of Etienne Balibar, modern legal personality rooted in Lockean notions of self-possession is constituted through acts of appropriation that take place both within the interior realm of knowledge and consciousness and the exterior realm of the world. This philosophical structure of the self-possessed subject was defined in relation to, for Locke, the figure of the savage Indian woman or child who lacked the capacity for self-possession. In reality, the status Indian was also denied the ability to appropriate land in a manner that would satisfy the conceptual criteria of the proper subject of law. So what I haven't gone into the detail that's in the chapter is how, when it comes to the economy of the reserve, any economic activities that would bear the hallmarks of the proper self-possessive individual were prohibited on the reserve. And there were heavy penalties for engaging in market relations for residents on the reserve. And that doesn't mean that people didn't do that, but this is what was embodied in the legislation. Okay. That's actually the last slide, even though I'm going to go on for a bit now about Locke. So, okay, the economy of the reserve bespeaks a regime of governance over land, labor, mobility, and cultural practices. The imbrication of identity with property relations here reflects the dominant episteme of a long era that remains very much with us. Macpherson most famously captured the relationship between market forces and the constitution of modern political subjectivity in his theory of possessive individualism. Analyzing theories of ownership as postulated by Locke, as well as Hobbes and others, Macpherson explores how the emergence in the 17th century of a market society inaugurated a concept of the subject who was defined primarily through his self-possession, defined by his capacity to alienate his labor in the marketplace and his ostensible freedom from reliance on others. What a fantasy. Those who could not alienate their labor in this way, of course, fell outside the bounds of the self-possessed proper subject. Now, Macpherson's thesis has been challenged on many bases. James Tully, for instance, critiques Macpherson's reading of Locke on the basis that it fails to deal squarely with questions of political sovereignty and universal rights and duties. In the same volume, Tully argues that Locke's concepts of political society and property are inappropriate to and misrepresent the problems of Aboriginal self-government and ecology. So James Tully has placed the colonial at the forefront of his reading of Locke. Neil Wood has also challenged Macpherson's work on the basis that that there's a troubling ahistoricism in Macpherson's work. And he goes on to explore the complex interrelation between the scientific drive for agricultural improvement and the increasing appetite for mercantile imperialism that really informed, in his view, Lockean theories of ownership. Now, while these criticisms of C.B. Macpherson's work and the engagements with Locke are very important in pointing to the weaknesses of this concept of the self-possessive individual, neither Tully nor Wood turn their attention to the place of race in the scientific, political, and economic dimensions of Locke's thought on property. And that is what I will try to do now. Now, if the logic of property relations in settler colonies derives from the justifications for property ownership engineered by Locke, such as the wasteland rationale, etc., how do we account for the identity property nexus upon which these property logics depend? Here I want to follow the work of Balibar in his book Identity and Difference, John Locke and the Invention of Consciousness, which starts to bridge the gap between Locke's theory of consciousness in the Essay on Human Understanding and his theory of property elaborated in the two treatises of government. And usually people who are studying property relations in the colonial context read the text, the two treatises of government, and don't really read the Essay on Human Understanding. And oftentimes analytic philosophers will read the work on consciousness without really thinking about the work on property. And Etienne Balibar does us a great service by trying to bring these texts together. Now, on Balibar's reading, the concept of the self in the essay not only moves closer to the political philosophy of property in the two treatises, but bears traits or qualities that mirror Lockean concepts of property and ownership. And there are two in particular that I will focus on. First, identity and property for Locke are formed through appropriation, which is a temporal concept and takes place through memory over time. Second, the connection between identity and property ownership is relational, encompassing both an interiority of the self and the exteriority of the world outside of it. This relational aspect of the self in Locke's thought mirrors the relational nature of property itself. In the settler colonial context, the attributes of this identity-property nexus are harnessed to push forward the civilizational imperative of the colonial authorities. So temporality and duration, two hallmarks of the property form, characterize the nature of appropriation that defines Lockean self-consciousness. Appropriation takes place through a process of identification wherein the individual, quote, practically identifies himself with that property which forms his essence. He recognizes his identity in the actual process of appropriation and acquisition of reflection or thought. So it is the recognition that one has a memory of past thoughts and thus one's ability to observe one's thoughts and reflections over time that constitutes the self for Locke. While this is itself not a particularly new insight, Balibar's interpretation usefully emphasizes that the reflection on memory takes place in the form of appropriation. This concept of appropriation reveals two things. One is that for self-consciousness or identity, appropriation is the mode through which the self constitutes itself or recognizes itself and is thus a continual process rather than a static one. I want to suggest that the ongoing nature of this process of appropriation finds a conceptual counterpart in the temporality of property ownership found in the two treatises, where Locke provides us with an origin story of private property. In the movement he makes from a divine to secular justification for the accumulation of property, Locke rationalizes the removal of common property for the use of individuals. At various stages of this transition, temporality and duration inform his concept of appropriation and ownership itself. So, labor, we all know Locke's theory of ownership is rooted in labor. Labor is the initial measure of how much one can legitimately appropriate. This is quickly bound by the amount that one can consume and in relation to the time it takes for goods to spoil. But that is quickly surpassed with this move into the abstract, limitless, and infinite accumulation of property with the introduction of currency. Now, Balibar's explanation of appropriation presents a fundamental challenge to an unnecessarily narrow interpretation of Locke's famous dictum that every man has a property in his own person. Property here signifies many things that are or constitute man: lives, liberties, and estates. And Balibar argues that the list represents, quote, the development of the progress of legitimate appropriation. The power of appropriation is the point of origin for the Lockean subject. The modern subject, so there's more here on Balabar, but I'm going to just skip that. The modern subject captures a, quote, paradoxical unity of opposites. That is, he is composed of qualities that are both alienable. I alienate my labor in the external world, and through this act of alienation come to own stuff, and inalienable. So the labor of continually constituting myself through reflection and exercising my powers of appropriation. Here, property meets propriety. Interiority and exteriority are conjoined through my power of appropriation. Now, Locke's primary concern was with fashioning a theory of self-consciousness that justified and fit organically with the non-absolutist form of government. Colonial governance and juridical representations of subjects of governance framed the constitution of categories of Indian and settler, and indeed the Indian Act regime. Now, how are assumptions about racial superiority smuggled into the formation of this Lockean subject? The primary place of interiority in the conceptualization of the Lockean subject, which on my reading is one version of Gayatri Spivak's Transparent Eye, sets the scene for an analytic of raciality that emerges in the 19th century. By locating the sovereign source of self in reason, Denise Ferreira da Silva finds, and I quote, the negation, the declaration of the onto-epistemological inexistence of exterior things, that is, the affirmation that, as objects of knowledge, phenomena, they constitute but effects of the interior tools of pure reason. In other words, racial subjects, the black, slave, the native, the savage, are located in an exterior realm of nature by scientific and philosophical discourses that give primacy to the subject of interiority. Locke's theory of consciousness and identity, as elaborated in the essay on human understanding, focuses on the ability of man to appropriate to himself recollections of his own thoughts and sensations. And this is central to his constitution. Now, I won't go into the detail, but in the essay, property metaphors are far from rare throughout the text. And in the introduction, Locke sets the scene of the essay by analogizing the quest for knowledge and understanding with the treacherous journey through a terra incognita and the unbounded dark space of the unknown. It is arguable that just as with the attempts to secularize the foundations of property and natural law in the two treatises, there is in the essay a history of, quote, the first beginnings of human knowledge that incorporates a racial anthropology of the human. Just as in the two treatises and the chapter of property, there is a prehistory of modern law in which Indians nourish themselves in the absence of enclosure, this kind of colonial fantasy. Locke's favorite quadrumvirate, easier to write than say, in the early part of the essay, composed of illiterate people, savages, idiots, and children, prove that there are no universal principles of knowledge. General propositions of knowledge are, to the contrary, the language of business schools and academies of learned nations for Locke. While the chapter Identity and Diversity distinguishes between brute animals and men in considering their capacities for reflection, it is arguable that the barbarians of a 17th century political imaginary, defined by their godlessness and lack of agricultural science, were also lacking in the capacity for interior reflection and recollection. The figure of the savage, and I'm going to conclude with this. The figure of the savage in Locke's essay and the two treatises finds its reflection in the juridical category of the Indian. The Indian is a subject without a past. The settler who has the capacity to preempt land fits into the Enlightenment historicism that equated cultivation with a narrative of civilizational progress. The property logic of Indian identity The property logic of Indian identity is entirely different from that of the self-possessed proprietorial subject. Its temporality is static rather than dynamic and of a cognizable duration. Indian status flattens time and congeals space into an economy that prohibits appropriation. The concept of memory, of recollection for Locke, of course, is not the same as memory of a historical past. However, both memory and recollection are, quote, indispensable to the use of any of our intellectual faculties, precisely because our intellectual faculties involve the selective retention and reactivation of dormant thoughts. Now, Balabar argues that ultimately Locke bestows a quasi-transcendental function on memory as central to consciousness itself. The recognition of personal identity is limited or demarcated by the memory of consciousness's past acts and thoughts. It is, and I quote, the memory trace that binds the present to the past and to which identity remains attached, end quote. This theory of consciousness, when cast in the domain of settler-colonial relations, can be understood, can be used to understand, rather, both regimes of governance over identity and resistance to them. Of course, First Nations have resisted the imposition of a racial regime of ownership that binds together identity and a particular theory of consciousness with access to and ownership of land, precisely through remaining attached to recollection of ways of being and thinking that import their own history and temporalities. On the other hand, it is also clear that the apparatus of the Indian Act and the residential school system were premised on the denial of First Nations' capacity and ability to keep hold of the memory trace that binds identity to the form of consciousness associated with the full and proper legal subject. In particular, the punishment of First Nations children, for instance, for speaking their native languages in the residential school system, was quite central to the colonial attempt to radically diminish the connection between memory and consciousness of one's identity as an Indigenous person. And thus, while the concept of recollection for Locke is not the same as memory of a historical past, it is quite clear that the Indian Act, along with the imposition of private property relations, was premised on the denial of First Nations' living memory of their relationships to land and place, an apparatus that had, as I've outlined in this talk, particularly devastating consequences for First Nations women. As Mahmoud Darwish reminds us, writing of another settler colonial context, the refusal to credit the colonized with a memory of place before settlement, before civilization, is intimately connected to the theft of rights and to the theft of land. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.